Imagine being trapped in a life where every decision leads you closer to a terrifying truth. What would you do if everything you thought you knew about yourself came crashing down? In this shocking true crime story, follow the twisted journey of a woman pushed to the edge of her own dark choices. One final door, one fateful decision. Will she escape, or is there no turning back? Stay with us till the end, because this is not just a story, it's a terrifying reality. You won't believe what happens next. The house was eerily quiet. Outside, the wind howled. The trees swayed violently. Inside, the silence was suffocating. An old clock ticked loudly in the hallway. The seconds felt like hours. She stood by the window, staring out into the dark. Her heart raced. Tonight would be different. Tonight, everything would change. The plan had been set in motion for weeks. No room for error. Her fingers gripped the edge of the curtain. She pulled it aside just a little, eyes scanning the yard. The street lights flickered. A car pulled into the driveway. It was him, her husband. She could feel her pulse quicken. This was it. She knew what she had to do. The door slammed shut. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house. She took a deep breath. Her body tensed, waiting. He walked into the living room. "Where are the kids?" he asked, voice thick with frustration. Her lips curled into a tight smile. "They're upstairs," she said. Her voice was calm, unnaturally calm. "Why is it so quiet in here?" he questioned. She didn't answer. Instead, she stared at him, eyes cold, unwavering. He furrowed his brow, confused. She felt nothing. Not anymore. The door to the kids' room creaked open. Her heart beat louder now. He was closer. She watched as he walked past, heading toward the stairs. But as he took the first step, something unexpected happened. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for the drawer. The drawer with the one thing she knew she couldn't live without. She gripped the object tightly. No turning back. Her breath caught in her throat as she made her way upstairs. She could hear his footsteps below, unaware of what was about to happen. The children were in their beds, sound asleep. The room smelled faintly of lavender and warmth. Everything was perfect, but her fingers trembled as she stood over them. Her gaze fell upon their peaceful faces. She hesitated for just a moment. Then, the silence was broken by the cold metal of the object in her hand. It was time. The cold metal felt heavy in her hand. Her breath was shallow, quick. She leaned closer to the bed, eyes fixed on their innocent faces. The room was still, the world outside a blur. Her fingers tightened around the object. Every heartbeat echoed in her ears. The weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her chest. She didn't even flinch. Not anymore. The children stirred slightly, but they stayed asleep. Her mind raced, but her body was steady. With a swift motion, she acted. The first one didn't wake. The second, too, stayed in their dream world. It was over. The silence in a room seemed to stretch for eternity. Her breath caught once more. The room felt smaller, suffocating. She turned, footsteps swift as she left. Her heart hammered in her chest. She reached the stairs just as he was turning the corner. His eyes met hers, but there was no recognition. "Not yet." He looked at her with confusion, then concern. "Why do you look like that?" he asked. She didn't answer. Her feet moved of their own accord, taking her back toward the door. The tension was unbearable. "Where are you going?" he called out, his voice trembling now. But she was already out the door. The cold night air hit her like a slap. Her pulse raced as she walked into the darkness. Behind her, the house stood still, unaware of the horror inside. Inside, the clock ticked. Its ticking was the only sound. For a moment, everything else disappeared. But she couldn't escape the growing feeling of dread. Her hands shook as she walked farther away. What had she done? Could she turn back? No. She wouldn't. Not after all this. There was no going back now. No undoing what had been done. Her heart raced faster. She could still hear their quiet breaths in her mind, still feel the weight of the metal. But she kept walking, step after step. Her future stretched out in front of her, dark and endless. No turning back. The wind bit at her skin as she walked, the chills sinking deep. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, spiraling out of control. What had she just done? Her mind couldn't settle on a single answer. Only fragments of the night flashed before her eyes. Her children, their peaceful faces, the stillness. Her heart felt like it was pounding in her throat. She forced herself to keep moving. Each step seemed heavier than the last. The world felt distant, like she was walking through a dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was reality. The reality she had chosen. She was past the point of no return. The night air stung her face as she finally reached the edge of the road. She could still hear his voice in her mind. The confusion. The fear. But it didn't matter anymore.
Not now.
Ahead, a car was parked by the side of the road. Its headlights dimmed, the engine cold. Her heart skipped a beat as she neared it. The driver was waiting for her. She slid into the passenger seat, her body feeling numb. The door clicked shut behind her. The man next to her glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Did it go as planned?" he asked. His voice was low, calm. She nodded. Barely. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, checking the dark road behind them. The car rumbled to life. The sound of the tires crunching on gravel filled the silence between them. For the first time that night, she felt a strange sense of relief. The pressure in her chest loosened just a little, but it didn't last long. As the car drove farther into the night, her thoughts came rushing back. The children, her family, what had driven her to this? The questions gnawed at her, but no answers came. Only the hum of the engine and the distant wail of sirens. The life she had left behind seemed like a fading memory. In the distance, the lights of the city grew dimmer. The road stretched on, and with each mile, she knew there was no turning back. Not anymore. The journey had begun, and the truth would never be the same again. The car sped through the darkened roads, the headlights illuminating the empty stretch of highway. She stared straight ahead, her mind a blur of images and feelings. The children's faces kept flashing before her eyes. Their innocence, their trust. And now the silence. Her stomach twisted. She couldn't shake the sensation that something wasn't right. Her fingers curled into her palms, nails digging into the skin. The driver didn't speak, but she could feel his eyes on her. His gaze felt like a weight, but she refused to meet it. The cold air in the car was thick with tension. Her breaths were shallow. The further they drove, the more detached she felt from everything she had known. The car turned sharply onto a secluded road. The world outside seemed to fall away as the trees pressed in closer. The driver glanced at her again. "You know this is the only way," he said softly. Her eyes flickered briefly to his, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. Her mind replayed the moments leading up to this. The plan had been clear, calculated. She had known what she was doing. But now, sitting in the car with no turning back, the weight of it hit her harder than she expected. "Don't worry," he continued, his voice low but firm. "It's all been handled." Handled. The word echoed in her mind, a grim reminder of the finality of it all. She turned her head to the window, the blur of trees outside giving her no comfort. Her stomach churned again, a knot she couldn't untangle. The car slowed to a stop. The engine cut off, leaving only the sounds of the forest. She looked at the driver, her eyes wide now. "Where are we?" Her voice sounded strange, distant, like someone else was speaking. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he got out of the car. The door opened with a soft creak. The night air was colder now. He didn't wait for her. With a sigh, she stepped out after him, the gravel crunching underfoot. Ahead, a small cabin loomed in the distance. Its windows were dark. Everything felt so empty. He motioned for her to follow him, and she did, her legs heavy with uncertainty. The door to the cabin creaked open, and he stepped inside without a word. She hesitated at the threshold. Something about the place felt wrong. It felt like the last place she should be. But there was no choice now. No turning back. She stepped inside, the darkness wrapping around her like a shroud. The door clicked shut behind her, and for the first time in hours, she felt a fleeting sense of fear. The air inside the cabin was thick with an unsettling stillness. It smelled of dust, of years of abandonment. The dim light of a single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the room. Her eyes adjusted slowly, taking in the barren space. There were no furnishings, nothing to suggest this place had ever been lived in. Only the remnants of a life that had long since been forgotten. Her heart began to race again. She glanced around, her breath quickening, wondering why they had come here. The man didn't speak as he moved toward the far corner of the room. He was focused on something, his movements deliberate. The silence was suffocating, each second stretching endlessly. She shifted nervously, her hand instinctively reaching for the door handle. But before she could make a move, he turned, his eyes locking onto hers. "Don't even think about it," he said, his voice low and cold. Her body froze. The tension in the room escalated, thick like smoke. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but the fear held her in place. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "What's going on?" she managed to ask, though the words barely escaped her lips. The man's face was unreadable as he moved to a small, dusty table in the center of the room. There was something on the table, an envelope. He reached for it, his fingers trembling slightly as he picked it up. His eyes never left hers as he placed it in front of her. The envelope was unmarked, no indication of its contents. She stared at it, fear rising in her chest. "I need you to open it," he said, his voice almost a whisper. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow. She hesitated. The man stepped closer, his presence looming over her. "Open it," he repeated, his tone growing colder. Her hands trembled as she reached for the envelope. She slid her fingers under the flap, heart racing. Inside was a single piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the words scrawled across it. Her stomach churned as she read. The message was short. "Everything you've done is just the beginning." Her mind spun, the words heavy with meaning she couldn't comprehend. The room seemed to close in around her as the man watched her, silent and still. She couldn't breathe. The words on the page haunted her, echoing in the darkness of the cabin. Her hands shook as she dropped the letter, her body frozen in place. The realization hit her with brutal force. She was trapped, and whatever she had started, whatever had led her here, was far from over. Her vision blurred as the weight of the words sunk in. Just the beginning. The room felt smaller, suffocating. The air thickened around her, each breath harder to take. The man remained silent, watching her with cold, calculating eyes. She could hear her heartbeat, a steady thrum in her ears, louder than the silence in the room. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. "What does this mean?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly turned away, moving toward the back of the cabin. He walked with purpose, each step deliberate. She followed him with her eyes, her mind racing, trying to make sense of everything. Why was she here? What was happening? And why did the letter feel like a warning, a dark promise of something worse to come? The man opened a small door at the back of the room and stepped inside, disappearing from view. For a moment, she was left in the eerie quiet, alone with her thoughts. Her hands trembled as she reached for the envelope again, as if she could somehow make sense of the cryptic message. But the words only mocked her. She had never felt so lost, so completely trapped. The seconds stretched on, agonizingly slow. And then she heard it. A soft creak. Footsteps. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned, but before she could react, the man appeared in the doorway again. This time, he wasn't alone. Two other figures stood behind him, cloaked in darkness. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Her heart pounded against her chest as they moved closer, their faces obscured by shadows. The man who had brought her here stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "This is where your choices come full circle," he said, his voice low and threatening. She took a step back, her mind scrambling for an escape, any way out. But there was no way out. She was cornered. The air grew colder, heavier. The two figures behind him moved to block the door, their presence suffocating. A wave of dread washed over her. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice shaking now. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile of reassurance. It was something else entirely. "We want you to finish what you started," he said, his tone cold, almost amused. The room felt like it was closing in on her. Her stomach churned again, the fear rising like a tide. She was trapped in this nightmare. And whatever happened next, there would be no going back. The coldness in the room deepened as the man's words settled in the air. "Finish what you started." Her body tensed, every muscle frozen. Her thoughts collided with each other, desperate for an answer. But there was none. She wanted to scream, to run, but the figures in the shadows made it impossible. Their presence was suffocating, overwhelming. The man watched her closely, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Don't fight it," he said, his voice steady. "You've already made your choice." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her throat went dry as the reality of the situation took root. She had chosen this path. But now, with everything unfolding, she couldn't understand how she had arrived here. She took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. "You think I'm going to help you," she finally managed, her voice hoarse but defiant. His lips curled into a slight, unsettling smile. "We don't need your help," he replied, his tone dripping with calm confidence. "We need you to finish it." The air in the cabin felt like it was closing in tighter with every passing second. She looked at the figures blocking the door, their faces still hidden. She couldn't see them clearly, but the way they moved, so precise, so calculated, made her uneasy. One of them stepped forward, closer to her. She flinched, but he didn't stop. Instead, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a small object. It gleamed faintly in the dim light. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized it. A phone. He handed it to her without a word. Her hands trembled as she took it, her fingers brushing against his cold skin. She stared at the phone, confused. "What is this?" she whispered, the fear creeping back into her chest. "Make the call," he said simply, his voice quiet but forceful. She stared at him, unable to move. The phone felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in her hand. The man didn't move, just watching her intently. Her breath caught in her throat. She had no choice. With shaking hands, she unlocked the phone and scrolled through the contacts. Her heart stopped when she saw the name. Her own husband. It was a direct line to him. She couldn't breathe. The man's voice cut through the tension, cold and clear. "You know what you need to do?" Her mind screamed in protest. But she knew. She knew what she had to do. And as her finger hovered over the call button, the weight of everything she had done pressed down on her with crushing force. There was no turning back now. Her finger trembled as it hovered over the call button. The silence in the cabin grew louder, deafening. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat like a drum of impending doom. The phone seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as if it was alive, waiting for her to make the call. Her breath was ragged now, her mind racing. She could hear her husband's voice in her head, the way he had spoken to her just hours before. The confusion, the concern. But now there was only one thing she had to do. A low voice whispered from the shadows. Do it. She didn't need to look up. She knew the figures were still standing there, watching her, waiting. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, fighting the urge to drop the phone and run. But she couldn't run anymore. Her finger pressed the button and the phone rang. The sound was loud, unbearable. The seconds stretched on, endless. And then, the voice on the other end. Hellos. It was his voice. Her husband. It sounded like it always did, calm, steady. But now, she could hear the tremor of concern creeping in. Hello? He asked again more urgently. Her throat tightened. She could feel her pulse in her ears, deafening. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. What was she supposed to say? Was there even a way back from this? His voice came again, more frantic now. Why aren't you talking to me? What's going on? She could hear him breathing heavily on the other end, could picture him pacing around the house, desperate to understand what was happening. But she couldn't answer. Not like this. Answer me, he demanded. His voice cracked. She closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. But it was no use. Her hand shook uncontrollably as she finally spoke. I've done something. Something terrible. The silence on the other end was suffocating. Then his voice came again, soft, confused. What do you mean? Her breath hitched. The words spilled out in a rush. I'm not who you think I am. I've been lying. I've done things. Horrible things. Her voice cracked, and for the first time that night, tears welled up in her eyes. I never should have. She was cut off. Stop, he said, his voice shaking now, barely a whisper. Her stomach twisted, a wave of nausea hitting her. She could almost feel the horror on the other side of the line. Where are you? He asked, his voice full of fear. But she didn't know what to say. The man's voice in the room grew louder, insistent. Finish it. Her breath caught again as she glanced at the figures in the shadows. They were watching her, waiting. She closed her eyes, pressing the phone to her ear. And then she spoke again, her voice barely audible. Goodbye. The phone clicked, and the line went dead. The room was silent. Her heart hammered in her chest. She had just made the call. But now, she didn't know if she could live with what she had done. The figures stepped closer, their faces still obscured in the dark. One of them spoke, his voice quiet but firm. Now, we move forward. And she knew, deep down, that there was no turning back from this point. Not anymore. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. The phone was still pressed to her ear, the faint hum of the dead line ringing in her mind. She slowly lowered it, her fingers feeling numb, as if the weight of the moment had drained all the strength from her body. The figures in the shadows moved closer, their presence suffocating. She could feel their eyes on her, could sense their waiting. Her legs felt weak, like they might give out at any second. Her heart pounded so hard, she thought it might burst from her chest. One of the figures stepped forward. It was the man who had brought her here. He was close now, his shadow stretching across the room, obscuring everything else. He didn't speak, but his gaze was piercing, knowing. You've done well, he said, his voice low and cold. Now, there's no going back. Her breath caught in her throat, her chest tight with fear. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, the man motioned to the door. Now it's time for the next step, he said, his tone flat, emotionless. Her stomach twisted, her mind a whirl of confusion and dread. She couldn't even fathom what could possibly come next. What could be worse than this? But she didn't have time to think about it. The man stepped aside, his gaze never leaving her. He gestured toward the door again. Move. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. Her legs were heavy as she moved toward the door. Her feet felt like they were dragging through thick mud, but she didn't dare stop. Behind her, the figures moved with silent precision, following her every step. The door creaked open as she stepped outside. The cold night air hit her like a slap to the face, making her skin crawl. She could see the car parked just beyond the cabin, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The same car. The same man who had been waiting for her. She didn't know where they were taking her. And she didn't want to know. But she couldn't turn back now. The man who had spoken to her earlier appeared beside her, his steps calculated and deliberate.
"Get in," he said.
The command was simple, and she obeyed. As she slid into the passenger seat, her eyes scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of hope. But there was none. The car roared to life, pulling away from the cabin. Behind them, the trees loomed, dark and ominous. Ahead, there was nothing but the road, stretching out into an endless night. Her heart was heavy with regret, with fear. But it was too late. There was no going back. Not anymore. And as the car disappeared into the night, she realized the truth. This was only the beginning. The car hummed steadily as it sped down the winding road, the headlights slicing through the blackness. Every bump and turn felt jarring, unsettling. Her fingers gripped the seat, knuckles white with tension. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being pulled deeper into something dark, something she could never escape. The man who had been sitting beside her remained silent, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. The darkness outside seemed to press in on her, a constant reminder of how far she had gone, how far she had fallen. She couldn't look at him, couldn't bring herself to speak. But his presence was suffocating, like a shadow that never left. Her mind kept replaying the moments, the calls, the decisions she had made. Her husband's voice still echoed in her ears, the confusion and fear in it. She could almost hear him asking, "What did you do?" But there was no answer now. Not for him. Not for anyone. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. The man beside her glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You'll know when we get there," he replied simply. It wasn't much of an answer, but it was all he gave. The minutes stretched on in agonizing silence. Her thoughts swirled, every possibility racing through her mind. But none of them made any sense. She wanted to scream, to fight, to tear through the walls that were closing in around her. But she knew it was useless. She was trapped in this nightmarish journey, with no way out. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness swallowing everything around them. Time lost all meaning. Suddenly, the car slowed, the engine humming to a near stop. Her heart skipped a beat. They had reached their destination. A small, run-down building loomed in the distance, barely visible in the weak light. It was hidden in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by overgrown trees and thick fog. The man in the driver's seat didn't look at her as he turned off the engine. "Stay close," he ordered. The door opened with a quiet squeak, and he stepped out. She hesitated, fear gripping her chest, but she knew there was no choice. Slowly, she followed him, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. The building before her seemed even more imposing up close, its broken windows and rotting walls giving off an air of neglect and decay. She could feel the weight of what was coming next. The man led her to the door, pushing it open with a creak that made her skin crawl. Inside, it was dark, too dark. The faint smell of mold and dust lingered in the air. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind her. The room was empty, save for a single light hanging from the ceiling. The man's voice broke the silence. "You're here now," he said, his words cold. "And now you finish it?" She didn't understand what he meant by finish it, but she knew it wasn't a question. The walls seemed to close in as she took a step forward. The shadows around her felt alive, watching her every move. The man stood at the doorway, watching her intently, as if waiting for her to make the next move. And she knew, deep down, there was no escaping this nightmare. This was the end. And the beginning of something much darker. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the air heavy with the oppressive stillness of the room. She stood there, frozen, every instinct screaming at her to run. But she didn't move. The man's gaze never wavered, his eyes fixed on her with a cold intensity. She felt trapped, her body rooted to the spot by an invisible force. "Finish it," he repeated, his voice a chilling command. His words lingered in the air like a cold breath, the weight of them suffocating. What was she supposed to finish? What had she started? Her mind raced, but there was no clarity, only a fog of confusion. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer, growing darker, and the walls felt like they were closing in. The man stepped forward, his footsteps deliberate, his presence towering over her. "You've already taken the first step," he said softly, his tone almost reassuring. "Now you take the last." Her heart beat wildly in her chest. "Last?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "What lasts?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, glinting in the low light.
A key.
It was old-fashioned, heavy, like something from another time. He held it up, the small metallic object gleaming in the dim light. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, his voice taking on a more measured, almost clinical tone. She stared at the key, her stomach twisting into knots. "No," she replied, her voice barely audible. The man smiled, a thin, unnerving smile. "It's the key to your future," he said. "The key to everything you've been trying to escape." He stepped closer, his breath cold against her skin. "Take it." Her hand trembled as she reached for the key. It felt heavy in her palm, like a weight she couldn't shake off.
But she didn't have a choice.
Taking a deep breath, she turned toward the door at the far end of the room, where the key seemed to beckon. The door looked old, rusted hinges and wood-worn by time, but it was sturdy, as if it had been waiting for her. She walked toward it, every step echoing in the silence. Her fingers hovered over the doorknob as the key felt like it was burning in her hand. She hesitated, her pulse pounding in her ears. What was behind this door? What had she really been brought here to do? The man's voice broke through her thoughts. "Open it." His words were sharp, final. With trembling hands, she slid the key into the lock. The metal clicked into place with an unsettling finality. She turned the handle. The door creaked open. A rush of cold air hit her, and her heart skipped a beat. Behind the door, there was nothing but blackness. Nothing but the unknown. The man stepped behind her, his presence almost suffocating. "Go ahead," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been preparing for this. It's your destiny." Her legs felt weak, but she couldn't stop herself. She stepped forward into the dark, and as she did, the door slammed shut behind her, sealing her fate. The room was completely dark, and the silence was deafening. She couldn't see a thing, but she could feel it, the weight of everything, and the terrifying truth that whatever was waiting for her in the darkness, there was no escape now, no turning back. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating her. It was so complete that it felt like she had become part of it. Her senses reeled as she stood there, heart racing, her breath quick and shallow. She couldn't see her hands in front of her face, couldn't see anything at all. She took a step forward, the floor beneath her cold and uneven. The sound of her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. "Where am I?" she thought, the panic rising like bile in her throat. Suddenly, a light flickered to life above her, casting a pale, flickering glow across the space. Her eyes squinted against the harsh, sudden brightness, her heart still pounding. She could barely make out the edges of the room, but it was unmistakable now, a large, empty space. Empty, except for the figure standing at the far end of the room. She froze, her breath catching in her chest. It was him, the man who had led her here. But now, his features were clearer, more defined in the light. He was standing tall, his face cold and unreadable. But his eyes, they weren't just cold. They were full of something else. Something she couldn't quite place. A sense of finality. Finish it. The words echoed in her mind again, as though the room itself was whispering them to her. The man's lips moved, but his voice came as a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere.
You're here now.
This is your moment. The choice is yours. Her heart slammed in her chest as she took a step back, her pulse racing. Choice. What choice? There was no choice. Not anymore. He took a step forward, his presence overpowering. You've already made your choice, he said, his voice low, almost soothing now. You just haven't realized it yet. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. It was as though her body was frozen, caught in a web of dread. Your past, the things you've done. His voice trailed off for a moment, then continued, more forceful. It's all been leading you here. And now, you have to face the consequences. Consequences. The words sent a shiver down her spine. Her mind was spinning. Her life was flashing before her eyes. Everything she had done, every decision that had led her to this moment, felt like it was suffocating her. But there was something else, too. A strange, chilling clarity. She was here. She couldn't run. She couldn't escape. And in that moment, she realized what he meant. She had already made her choice when she stepped into the darkness. There was no going back. And whatever came next, she would have to face it. He stepped closer, his presence closing in around her. The light above flickered again, casting long shadows on the walls. Time to face the truth, he said softly, almost as if he were consoling her. But there was no comfort in his words. Only the chilling certainty of what lay ahead. And with that, she felt it. The suffocating grip of fate. The weight of everything she had done. Everything she had become. And in that moment, she knew. The end was coming. But it wouldn't be the end of her. It would be the end of everything she had ever known. The air around her seemed to thicken, as if the very atmosphere was closing in. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest, a frantic rhythm that echoed in the silence. She had never felt so small, so powerless. The man's eyes were locked onto hers, unwavering, like he could see into her very soul. You've come so far, he said softly, almost as if to himself. But this is where it all matters. The final choice. Her mind screamed in protest. What choice? What was he talking about? But the words were like poison, seeping into her thoughts, making everything feel even more surreal, more inevitable. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath, but it was as though the air itself was slipping through her lungs. The shadows around her seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the edges of the room distorting as though the walls were closing in. You can still walk away, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos in her mind. But it's a choice only you can make. There's no one else here. Only you. And the truth, she didn't understand. The weight of the key in her pocket was a constant reminder of something that had started this whole nightmare. But what was she really supposed to face here? What was the truth? Her thoughts were a whirlwind, but they kept coming back to one thing, her past. Everything she had done. Every lie. Every betrayal. She had stepped into this world of darkness, driven by choices that had already been made long ago. And now it was time to face the consequences. She looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. What happens now? Her voice cracked under the weight of the question. The man's lips curved into a smile, almost too slow, too calculated. Now, he said, his voice like ice, now you decide. You either walk through the door behind you or face the truth here. Her eyes flickered to the door behind her. It was barely visible, a sliver of light seeping through the cracks in the frame. But something about it felt wrong, as if it was an illusion, a false hope. She knew, deep down, that whatever was behind that door, whatever lay on the other side, was not freedom. It was just another trap. Another lie. Her gaze returned to him, and she took a deep breath. She felt like she was choking, suffocating under the pressure. But there was no turning back. No matter which way she went, no matter what choice she made, the truth was already upon her. She felt the weight of the key again, pressing into her side, as though it had a life of its own. Her hand moved instinctively to it, pulling it from her pocket. The man's eyes tracked her every movement, his gaze intense, almost waiting. "I know what you're thinking," he said quietly. "But you already know what the truth is. And you can't run from it." She clutched the key tighter, her fingers shaking, her breath shallow. He was right. She knew. She had already made her choice. It had already been made for her long ago. There was no way to outrun the consequences of her actions. "Face it," the man said one last time, his voice a low command. Her eyes closed, a wave of resignation washing over her. And when she opened them again, she was ready. The truth was here. And it would be the end of everything. But it would also be the beginning of something far darker than she had ever imagined. The moment of reckoning had arrived. And now there was no going back. The moment hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She could feel it now, the finality of the choice. The weight of everything she had done crashing down on her like an avalanche. The man's eyes never left her, watching, waiting. His expression was unreadable, his face a mask of cold detachment. But she could see it now, something dark behind his gaze, something that made her feel small and insignificant. She couldn't breathe.
She couldn't think.
Her fingers tightened around the key, the cold metal pressing into her skin, as though it were a part of her now. She had carried it with her through the darkest moments of her life, but this was different. This was the point of no return. The door behind her beckoned, a sliver of light shining through the cracks. It seemed like a way out, like salvation. But deep down, she knew it was a lie. It was another trap, another illusion designed to make her believe there was an escape. The man stepped closer, his presence so overwhelming that she felt like she might drown in it. His voice was low and dangerous as he spoke again. "Time's running out," he said, his tone barely a whisper. "You've already made your choice. Don't waste any more time." She could feel the pulse of fear in her veins, but something else stirred within her too. A kind of acceptance. Her eyes drifted back to the door. She had already been through so much. What more could she possibly face? What could be worse than this? Her breath caught in her throat as the truth finally hit her like a tidal wave. She had already walked into the darkness. She had already sealed her fate the moment she made the decision to walk this path.
There was no escaping it now.
No hiding. No denying. Her heart pounded as she stepped toward the door. The man's gaze was unwavering, but this time, it didn't matter. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. With trembling hands, she turned the doorknob, and the darkness swallowed her whole. The door creaked open, and the chill of the unknown rushed in, a cold, unrelenting presence that seemed to seep into her bones. She hesitated for only a moment, but it felt like an eternity. Her breath hung in the air, a fog of fear and resignation. Behind her, the man stood silent, waiting. His presence was almost unbearable now, like a shadow that had been with her every step of the way. His voice was absent, but she could feel the weight of his expectations pressing down on her. She had come this far. There was no turning back. She had already crossed the threshold into a world that no longer made sense. The key in her hand was heavy, too heavy for her trembling fingers. The decision was hers now, but in truth, it had always been out of her control. The path she had walked, the choices she had made, had led her to this very moment, and the realization settled in her chest like a stone. She stepped forward, her feet moving almost of their own accord, propelled by an unseen force. The door opened wider, and she could see the room beyond, dimly lit, but familiar. It wasn't what she expected. There were no walls of shadow, no ominous figures, just an empty space. a space that felt oddly peaceful. For the first time in what seemed like forever, she exhaled. Her heartbeat slowed. The overwhelming weight of the darkness that had followed her all this time began to lift, as if the very act of stepping through the door had released her from some invisible bond. Her mind, still foggy with fear and confusion, began to clear. She took in her surroundings, the stillness of the room, and realized that it was not an end. It was a beginning. The man's voice reached her ears one last time, but it wasn't cold or demanding. "You've made it," he said softly. "Now you're free." For the first time, the truth washed over her not as a punishment, but as an awakening. She had been shackled by her own choices, but now, in this empty room, in the quiet, she could breathe again. She wasn't trapped anymore. The darkness had finally receded, leaving only the light of her own reflection. And in that moment she understood. The real journey had only just begun.